Here's my quick summary for session 2 of Vaesen, played with the Spelens Hus group, with Peter doing the GMing and introducing the game to the rest of us. And it's all about the recording. The sound on the recording settings shifted on me, defaulted for some reason, and I didn't catch it, and a bunch of stuff that I recorded diligently, most of the sound was unusable. Well, therefore, I'll give a quick summary now that we've played session 3, so you can sandwich this between them and use your perceptions of both of those sessions for anything that I may say about this one. First of all, in terms of just what happened, our characters had come upon the corpse of the woman that they were supposed to meet or look after in Krokek. And so we picked up play immediately from that point. After scoping the situation regarding the body and avoiding notice, if at all possible, that is to say, no passersby saw us standing over the body and discussing it. After a little bit more interaction, social interaction of things like getting a townsperson to call the constable from a neighboring town, we made our way to the guest house where we effectively, had been told this is where Olga lived and this is where all this sort of trouble might be happening. So, but now that Olga was murdered, we found ourselves for a little bit at the guest house before anyone else knew about that, and therefore perhaps with some leeway to do some investigating before everybody's kind of locked down in terror and disgust and basically horror. I mean, it was very vile mutilation of the body. So the kinds of investigations that occurred were split into two kinds. One was based on observation, things Peter told us that we saw, including two gentlemen, one Finnish in the guest house who, we keep seeing them about, a set of paintings in and around the guest house in each of the rooms, for example, that are exceptionally beautiful, as well as, strangely, 3 easels that have been set up in the dining room overlooking the water, in which are scrawled with bad daubs of, very, very inexpert scribblings. We have not yet seen the actual painter of the good paintings. We, different members through different things, have learned that there are 3 women living in a room upstairs who are a little spooky, and they are the ones who've been working on these paintings, and that Olga had, interacted with them in some way. Okay, so those are sort of things that people are picking up through conversations. In particular, it is, Peter tells us that Elsa, Helma's character, knows the serving woman there, who is also important in that she's stuck with running this guest house for the last week or so because the woman who actually runs the joint has disappeared recently. So with this stated, I should point out that a great deal of this is kind of landed on us as you see this and this happens, you see that happens, and Helma, this character and she tells you this. So there's not a whole lot of resolution involved in the parts that I mentioned. Now, other things, however, involved a lot of resolution, and those were things in which the players became rather active in what they wanted to do. I should mention a couple of other things. We were joined by another player who many of you are familiar with. Max has joined, so now we have 6 player characters. 3 of which are male, including my character Otto the Vicar, his somewhat thuggish but well-meaning assistant, henchman, Hilding, a vagabond boy named Magnus. The 3 women characters, Helma is playing Elsa, who is a sort of solid citizen huntress type, a younger woman though, not quite married. And then Henna is playing an unusual character who is prematurely aged by a curse, and who is actually an author. So, so you could think of her as something of an eccentric or oddball who kind of fits in society in a successful way, but is also, a little strange. And then finally, Max's character, an older character who actually is kind of your classic rogue, thiefly lady who can get by in all manner of social situations, is extremely watchful, extremely perceptive and manipulative, and basically, steals for a living. So it turns out she's been a member of our society all along. All right, so with the three of them, and interestingly enough, three dogs, Magnus, the vagabond boy, and Beatrice the thief, and Elsa the huntress, all have dogs. So, we can think of all these tails and tongues and, critters around, basically 9 characters. Well, what did these rapscallious people get up to? It quickly becomes clear that once in action, our society is heavily supplied with, ne'er-do-wells. And it's not too surprising that Hilding, Beatrice, and Magnus get up to breaking into Olga's room. After all, the poor woman has no use for it anymore, and we are dealing with Vaesen. We are dealing with a horrible murder. We are dealing with a bit of a tragedy that we actually had gone to help this woman, and we couldn't. So, Otto sort of off the leash at this point, what with people being eviscerated and stuff, is thinking, go to it, that. So they tacitly gives the nod for, these scamps to go and start breaking and entering and otherwise being completely bad citizens. This is actually something of a surprise to Elsa. Remember how I said how these characters had these starting textual relationships with one another, and I was wondering how that was going to factor into play. Well, as soon as Peter says, "What do you do?" the players are jumping into this. Relations and opinions, differences and similarities of opinions are appearing here and there. The interaction, Otto doesn't like Magnus, but Magnus has chosen to stay instead of fleeing into, the hinterland upon the discovery of the body, and that impresses Otto. He's like, oh, well, maybe I'm being too harsh, judging this boy too harshly. Other characters are giving evidence of their relations with one another, and so how does this break-in go? The upshot is that they do get into the room and they find out nothing. How this relates with rolling is there's a lot of dice rolling, but how it relates to what's going on is trickier. The game includes the option for opposed rolls, so therefore it's hard to tell sometimes, when you get a bunch of successes, how that relates to what happens, or when you get information some other way and there was no roll. So there's a I'm not claiming that, I should see all of this transparently laid out in front of me, and it would be a lot easier if we were in person and everybody was just, using the instrumentation very much in front of everybody. On screen, it's a little harder to tell. But I should point out a number of things. Magnus had climbed up the outside of the building to get into Olga's window. The other characters had come in, or trying to come in through the door. And this is something that's tricky in this game at the moment, is knowing where everybody is. For a bit there, it was hard to tell whether Magnus had, come in through Olga's window or had come in some other way, was in the hallway with the other characters. There was some similar things with Helma's character sitting in the dining room and specifically looking a certain way as stated, and then it's told that, you see this, you see that, and there's sort of a question of, well, I was not pointing that way. What do I see? How do I see that? So the players and so it's fair to say the players are paying a lot of attention to what they say and how their characters are placed physically in this or that part of the room or the guest house in general. But that tends to shift based on what piece of information is incoming. So there's kind of a verbal adjustment going on all the time of, okay, so where were we? And sometimes the players a player will put their foot down and say, that isn't where I was, or that's not what I was doing. Other times a player will say, okay, and just readjust to where they apparently are or what they are apparently doing. So, other bits of information, the people upstairs briefly run into the three women, or one of the three women who lives upstairs, gets kind of a look at them. But by the time that the shenanigans upstairs, which, as I say, yield very little out of Olga's room, by the time those are completed, there's been some conversation with that serving woman that I talked about. My character Otto actually has been in his room, and this is getting ready to come downstairs to eat. Actually, he eats there for a bit, but he goes back up to the room for one reason or another. And Peter, at the end of the session, draws upon one of Otto's sheet features, which is that the devil talks to me. I must say Peter does a hell of a devil. And I'm very sorry that the recording cannot share this with you. The devil said things that made Otto very upset and unhappy, especially because Otto is often very confused because he has doubt, you see. So he's very confused about which one's the devil and which one's God when he prays. Which one is he praying to? When one of them talks to him, which one is talking to him? So he's going to hit the bottle pretty hard, but that I knew right away as soon as this happened. But so the devil talks to him, and it's very threatening and very terrifying. So that's where the second session concluded. I've posted now the third session, so you can kind of sandwich this in there and see the way that we play this game with any number of discussable features.